All right. Thanks, everybody. And thanks for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you here today to discuss a framework for unifying at-risk user research. I'm Noel. Before I start, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the University of Maryland, Kaitlyn, Omer, Nathan, and my advisor, Michelle, and our wonderful colleagues at Google as well, Tara, Sunny, Patrick, Manya, and Kurt. So at-risk users, by the definition of our SoK, are people who experience risk factors like societal factors, relationships, or personal circumstances that augment or amplify their chances of being digitally attacked compared to general users and or suffering disproportionate harms. So the question is therefore, how do we design for these users? The common advice in the literature on this topic is to consider at-risk users in the research and technology design processes, but that can be bewildering given the variety and scope of the needs that these users have, regardless of the desire of researchers and technologists to do so. As an example of differing needs, compare the circumstances of a survivor of intimate partner abuse and a high-profile journalist. So a survivor of intimate partner abuse has a direct relationship with their attacker, who therefore has intimate physical access to their devices, and the goal of the survivor is to achieve, most of the time, some kind of permanent separation from this person, both physically and digitally. In comparison, though, a high-profile journalist might have a highly resourced adversary, like a nation-state who doesn't want them to publish X, Y, or Z. They may also have access to institutional support through their newsroom, and they might work with sources who have their own requirements for communication, which could limit the options that they can use to protect themselves. So, accordingly, we present a synthesis of this work from the past 7 or 8 years in order to guide research and tech development in the future. So how did we do this? In order to create the synthesis, we collected security, privacy, and HCI papers from 2016 to 2020, resulting in 6,534 papers. We wanted to cast a wide net at this stage in the process to fetch as many potentially relevant papers as possible. We then iteratively selected a subset of these papers that directly studied at-risk users. First, by reviewing titles and abstracts, and then by discussing potentially relevant papers as a team. We wanted to focus on papers that dealt specifically with at-risk users in the context of their digital safety concerns. This resulted in our final dataset of 95 papers. Then we performed thematic analysis on our final dataset in order to develop our framework, which I will now describe. So here's a summary of the at-risk framework's major components. First, we identified the factors that augment or amplify digital safety risk for these users, which are divided into 3 broad categories: broad societal factors, specific relationships that expose them to risk, and a variety of personal circumstances that elevate digital safety risk. We also identified 3 categories of protective practices and strategies at-risk users employ to ameliorate those risks. Strategies that rely on their social networks and connections, reducing the use of or distancing themselves from technology, and specific technical solutions and tools. While the individual practices in these categories will change over time, particularly technical solutions, we believe these larger categories are comprehensive. So, now I'm going to go into some more detail about the contextual risk factors. We identified a comprehensive set of 10 of these in these 3 categories, and on the following slides, I'll discuss each of them. So first, our first set of contextual risk factors are the societal factors I mentioned, so broad social or political considerations that impact one's digital safety. The 3 factors in this category are legal or political, where the laws and policies of government or political activity have an impact on your digital safety profile. Marginalization can have an impact on this, particularly in the realm of harassment, but not exclusively. And particularly restrictive social norms might actually impact what you're expected to do or what you're able to do in order to negotiate digital safety with others. I'll emphasize that these are some of the examples of populations that experience not every single one. I encourage you to check out our paper for more details on that. The second category of contextual risk factors are the specific relationships that impact a user's digital safety. First, having a direct relationship with the attacker, as in the case, for example, of intimate partner abuse, dramatically changes one's digital safety position. Having reliance on a third party, even one that is beneficial, can also have an impact on this. Think of this is increasing the attack surface for the individual, or maybe some sort of impersonation can be an issue there. And then some users have access to other at-risk users, like journalists and their sources. So the journalists themselves may not be the direct target, but they might receive particular targeting because someone wants to get access to the source that they're communicating with. Finally, a variety of personal circumstances might contribute to these users' digital safety. So particular prominence can expose one to more risk. The more people know who you are, the more likely you might be to be targeted. Particular resource or time constraints can have a significant impact on digital safety, particularly in the areas of recovering from negative incidents. Underserved accessibility needs are a problem across all of technology, and digital safety is not exempt from that by any means. And finally, having access to some sort of specific sensitive resource, much like having access to other at-risk users, might put you at greater risk. We also observed that these contextual factors can interact with one another. So for example, resource or time constraints made it harder to cope with other risk factors. Underserved accessibility needs and reliance on a third party often combined, and prominence added focused targeting to other risk factors, which I will explain now in more detail as an example. So, an example from Lerner et al. From Kai 2020 is that an LGBTQ person who experiences marginalization and maybe harassment as a result, who then becomes prominent due to their activism, might experience much more highly targeted harassment as a result of those two factors interacting with one another, creating a sort of a new experience that is outside either one of those individually. So now I'm going to discuss the protective practices in some more detail. So this part of our framework is talking about what at-risk users currently do about digital safety threats, which emerge from the contextual risk factors that they experience, and are neither mutually exclusive nor necessarily ideal. However, understanding current protective practices allows us to gain important insights into the priorities and needs of these users, even if those protections are not necessarily perfect. So some users protected themselves by using social connections to overcome digital safety threats. For example, one of the several social strategies we observed is that some users would seek help from trusted others, like family, friends, or certain trusted organizations for assistance with digital safety. And as another example, some users will preemptively disclose sensitive information in order to control their self-narrative and prevent this information being used against them in the future. The second category of protective practices was limiting technology use rather than engaging with other solutions, which was incredibly pervasive across our data set. Some examples included users physically destroying compromised devices when they did not know how to make those devices safe, and reducing online participation through self-censorship in order to protect themselves from abuse or perhaps heightened surveillance. Finally, of course, at-risk users employ a variety of tools and technologies for digital safety protection with varying levels of effectiveness and impact. Some users in our dataset do indeed use secure communication tools like encrypted messaging apps or even PGP, and some users also employ tracking and monitoring applications, often to support others, like think of parents and teenagers or people who are caretakers of older adults. So during the thematic analysis that led to the development of this framework, we also identified a set of barriers that prevented at-risk users from adopting protective practices, as informed by the particular contextual risk factors that they experience. The first example of this were priorities that competed with digital safety. Collins has provided us already in this session a perfect example of that. So as we know, for everybody, digital safety is not always and cannot always be the top priority. This is true for people in general, and especially for at-risk users. For example, some users may be motivated to use potentially risky modes of communication in order to participate in activist communities, despite the dangers that they could face if this communication was compromised in some way. As a human rights activist memorably said in Mazurek and Paxson 2017, should I spend half a day figuring out digital security or do work? As another example, journalists often described using less secure methods of communication with sources because the need to communicate in a way that worked for those sources outweighed the privacy concerns that they might have had regardless of what their personal preferences were. Our second major barrier was lack of knowledge or experience. There are many examples in the literature which demonstrate users have limited digital safety knowledge. On top of general knowledge, though, at-risk users need to implement robust protections in order to combat sophisticated attackers like nation states or counter intimate threats, as I've already described, and they often are required to do so under severe resource and time constraints. For example, not being able to get a new device that has like the most up-to-date security measures or something like that. Lack of knowledge or resources makes all of the challenges that these users face even worse because they have difficulty sometimes dealing with them. Finally, we noticed that at-risk users' threat models often broke some common design assumptions. In South Asia, for example, it is very common for families to share devices and accounts due to strong social norms, violating this idea that one device has one set of accounts on it, which corresponds to one person. Another example is technology access. For example, multi-factor authentication that depends on a mobile phone could be inaccessible to people experiencing homelessness who are unable to consistently pay a phone bill, so they would have to turn it off and be less secure. Finally, although digital safety options that are too numerous may be difficult to use, some at-risk users have highly contextual digital safety needs, which leads to these users needing direct granular control of the security settings of their devices. Survivors of intimate partner abuse, for example, need to very carefully navigate the nuances of their relationship with the attacker that they face. And so they need granular access to these controls. So the question remains, I've been talking about this framework for 11 minutes. What is it for? We believe that in the research space, this framework can help us identify populations that might benefit from in-depth study, like the ones described in our dataset, and to continue to investigate populations that have already been studied. For example, real estate agents have access to a sensitive resource, as depicted in some news media, and may be specifically at higher risk because of that, but that's not currently represented to my knowledge in the literature. We also believe that this framework can help us identify the interactions that I was talking about earlier. We know that this happens, but we don't yet know enough about which contextual factors interact, how this happens, and what the end result of those interactions can be. We also believe that this framework can be used to guide how this research can be conducted. For instance, one might ask about all of the contextual factors when interviewing a new population to make sure nothing is missed. One challenge in identifying working through this data set is all this research is conducted in different ways, so looking for what we were looking for was sometimes a challenge. We also believe this framework can be useful for technology creators. This framework can be used to consider at-risk users at scale. As mentioned at the beginning of this talk, considering dozens of populations in the design process is, of course, very difficult. By providing this framework, we simplify the important process of thinking through potential risks and needs of different populations. The framework can also be used to help point technology creators to areas where improving usability and accessibility might be most useful and help prioritize that, as demonstrated by our systemization of protective practices. We also know that, of course, there's no such thing as perfect digital safety, and so every new technology has trade-offs. However, some of the practices that we identified, like distancing behaviors, have significant downside, like reduced participation. Careful evaluation of potential designs using our framework can help technology teams reason about how to balance these various risks and benefits. So to sum it up, we developed a framework for understanding at-risk users, which enumerates 10 contextual risk factors and 3 categories of protective practices. This framework also reveals some barriers that at-risk users face to implementing secure behaviors, and we provide a direction for research and technology moving forward in this space. I would like to thank all of these organizations for making this research possible, and you're more than welcome to send me an email at this email address or come chat with me after the session, and I'm now happy to take questions. Thank you.
Questions for our speaker?
Hi, great talk. I was wondering, how do you define at-risk users? Like, if you were to define it, I know there's a framework, but just in general, what would you say is at-risk users?
So this would be what I would consider to be our final definition, which is sort of deliberately broad. We don't really want to, like, it is sort of a thorny question, is like, who is at risk enough kind of to be considered in this framework. But maybe almost tautologically, I would say that someone who experienced some of these contextual risk factors would be candidates. So like usually though, we consider more likely to be attacked for some reason, some characteristic, or the harms that they experience, which may be the same harms as anybody else, might be disproportionate in their scope because of their particular circumstances. Like if my home address was leaked, if I was doxxed, my experience of that would be very different from somebody who has experienced partner abuse because of the circumstance, right? Like that result is much more devastating. Like it's not pleasant for me as someone who's not had that experience, but the end result is much worse in some of these contexts.
Okay, I had a follow-up question.
Sure.
So by digitally attacked, do you mean just attacks that happen online and stay online, or do you mean ones that could also lead to offline consequences?
I would include both of those, but we were focused mostly on the digital safety domain. So our conferences that we looked at were both major security and privacy conferences as well as the HCI space generally. But some of the papers in our data set certainly cross those lines, like work on intimate partner abuse. That it's a fluid, like digital mediation was an important part of that, but obviously has some in-person ramifications as well.
All right, any more questions? Let me check the chat. No? All right, then it looks like we're done. Thank you again.
Thank you.